The call came on December 23rd, just after I'd finished wrapping the last of the gifts for my grandchildren. Gifts I now understood I wouldn't be delivering. "Dad, look, I've been meaning to talk to you about Christmas." My son's voice had that careful quality it always got when he was about to disappoint me and had already decided he wouldn't feel bad about it. "Annette's parents are driving in from Moncton, and you know how she gets when there's too much going on. She needs the house to feel calm. This year just isn't a great time for you to come." I stood in my kitchen in Halifax with tinsel still on my fingers and tried to understand what I was hearing. "She needs the house to feel calm," I repeated. "Don't make it into something, Dad. It's one Christmas." It was never one Christmas. It had been 4 in a row now, and we both knew it. I said, "Okay." I said I understood, and after I hung up, I sat down at my kitchen table and looked at those wrapped gifts for a long time. A remote-controlled car for my grandson, a coloring set for my granddaughter, and I thought about the fact that my son had just made a family decision on behalf of his wife without even pretending to apologize for it. My name is Winston Hale. I'm 62 years old, and I'm telling you this story now with 5 years of distance I didn't have when it was happening. I'd moved to Halifax 14 months before that Christmas. After 31 years in Thunder Bay, I needed to go somewhere I didn't know every street corner by grief. My wife Carol passed in 2019. Heart attack, fast, no warning, and without her, the house felt like a museum of a life I no longer lived in. My daughter Thea was in Halifax. That felt like enough of a reason. I found work at a hardware store on Roby Street. Nothing glamorous, but honest. I knew tools. I knew how things were built and how they fell apart. Some days, that felt like the most useful knowledge I had. My son Dean was still in Thunder Bay with Annette and their 2 kids. He was 41. Annette was 38. She had opinions about everything and the confidence of someone who'd never once been told her opinions were wrong. She hadn't liked me. I'd understood that much within 2 years of their marriage, and somewhere along the way, Dean had simply adopted her feelings as his own, the way some men do. You watch it happen slowly, so slowly that by the time you name it, it's already finished. So on the night of December 23rd, I made a reservation at a restaurant. I wasn't going to sit in my apartment and eat leftover soup alone on Christmas Eve. I wasn't going to call Thea and ruin her evening with James, her fiancé. I wasn't going to let Dean's decision become the whole story of my night. I put on a decent shirt. I walked down to a place on Barrington Street I'd passed 100 times without going in. The restaurant smelled like mulled wine and roasting potatoes. Every table seemed to contain a family, real whole, noisy families passing bread baskets and finishing each other's sentences. I was seated near the window with a view of the street, where Christmas lights reflected off the wet pavement, and I sat there and tried to feel like less of an exhibit. I was managing fine until the food arrived. I don't know what it was exactly. Maybe it was the way the server had said, "Enjoy your meal," so sincerely to a table of one. Maybe it was seeing a grandfather across the room lift his granddaughter up so she could reach the Advent candle in the center of the table. Maybe it was just December 23rd, and I was 62 years old, and I was sitting alone because my son's wife needed the house to feel calm. Whatever it was, the tears came before I could catch them. I pressed my napkin to my face. I turned toward the window. I told myself I was just looking at the streetlights. "Excuse me." The voice was warm and unhurried. I turned to find a woman standing beside my table, mid-70s, white hair pulled back, neatly, a cardigan, the color of dried heather. She was looking at me with the particular attention of someone who has spent a lifetime noticing what other people miss. "I don't mean to intrude," she said, "but that's not allergies." I almost laughed. I managed something close to it. "No," I admitted, "it's not." She pulled out the chair across from me without asking. "My name is Cordelia," she said, "and I have a table of 7 people over there who've already eaten half the turkey and have no shortage of opinions about everything. You would be doing me an enormous personal favor if you came and sat with us." I looked at her table. A younger woman, her daughter, clearly, same wide-set eyes, was already watching us with a small smile. Beside her, a man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead was pouring wine. And squeezed into a high chair at the end of the table was a small girl in a red dress who was currently constructing a tower out of dinner rolls with the focused intensity of an engineer. "I'm a stranger," I said. "So is everyone I've ever loved at some point," Cordelia replied. "Come on. My son-in-law Jacques will eat all the roasted potatoes if we don't get back soon, and I want you to have some." I don't know why I said yes. I think it was because she made it sound like the most ordinary thing in the world. Like, of course, a man sitting alone on Christmas Eve belonged at their table. Like there was no other reasonable conclusion. I stood up. Cordelia walked me across the restaurant as though she'd done it 100 times. Her daughter's name was Celeste. Her husband was Jacques, a good-natured man from Quebec City who had a laugh that arrived before he did. The little girl in the high chair was Pippa, 5 years old, missing one front tooth, deeply invested in the structural integrity of her dinner roll tower. They made room for me as though they'd been expecting me. Cordelia's husband Basil, a quiet man with kind eyes, shook my hand and said simply, "Good. Now we're balanced." I ate Christmas Eve dinner with strangers that night. I told them I was from Thunder Bay. I told them I had a daughter in Halifax. I told them I worked at a hardware store on Roby Street. I didn't tell them about Dean, but at some point during dessert, Cordelia looked at me over her creme brulee and said, "You're carrying something heavy. You don't have to tell me what it is, but you don't have to carry it alone tonight." I looked at this woman I'd known for 2 hours. "My son told me not to come home for Christmas," I said. "His wife doesn't want me there." Cordelia set down her spoon. "Then he made a foolish choice," she said, simply, clearly, without dramatics. "And you made a brave one coming out tonight instead of disappearing." She reached across the table and patted my hand once, firmly. "Come for Boxing Day dinner," she said. "We do it every year. Basil makes a terrible trifle and everyone eats it anyway because we love him." I started to protest. She cut me off. She pulled a business card from her purse and wrote on the back in neat, careful handwriting, 2 o'clock. Don't bring anything except yourself. You'd be doing us a kindness. I drove home through Halifax streets glittering with December snow, and I held that business card on the passenger seat the whole way like a compass. Boxing Day came. I stood outside Cordelia and Basil's house in the south end of Halifax for 4 minutes before I knocked, long enough to almost talk myself out of it, not long enough to actually leave. The house was a Victorian semi-detached with a wreath on the door and a child's boots abandoned on the front step. I could hear voices inside, real voices overlapping, laughing at something. Basil answered before I'd finished knocking. He looked at me and smiled the slow smile of a man who'd been expecting someone. "Winston," he said, "come in out of the cold." I stepped inside, and that was the beginning of something I didn't have a name for yet. By February, I had a standing invitation to Sunday dinners. By March, little Pippa had decided I was her personal authority on all matters involving tools, screws, and how things are built. By April, I had a drawer in their guest room with a change of clothes in it, because I'd started arriving Saturday afternoons to help Basil with projects around the house. And sometimes it simply made more sense to stay. Cordelia had a way of watching people. Not intrusively, she was never intrusive, but with the steady attention of someone who understood that most people are working very hard not to be seen, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is simply see them anyway. One Sunday in March, she asked me about Dean. I told her the fuller version, not just Christmas Eve, but the years before it, the gradual withdrawal, Annette's increasing hostility at family gatherings, the way Dean had slowly adopted her grievances until he could no longer distinguish them from his own, the birthday calls that stopped, the missed visits, the sense that I was being phased out of my son's life so gently and so consistently that it was almost impossible to name the exact moment it had happened. Cordelia listened to all of it without once trying to fix it or minimize it. "His loss," she said finally, "every bit of it." 2 words, but when she said them, I believed them. I called Thea the next morning. We talked for an hour and a half. She told me about the wedding planning. She told me about James's family, and at the end of the call, she said, "Dad, I've never heard you sound like this before." "Like what?" "Like you're actually okay," she said. "Not just man actually okay." I thought about Cordelia and Basil's kitchen on a Sunday evening. I thought about Pippa's missing tooth grin when I showed her how a level works. I thought about sitting on their back porch with the harbor view while the city went dark around us. "I think I am," I said. 7 months after Christmas Eve, my phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon while I was cataloging a new shipment of pipe fittings in the hardware store's back room. "Dean." I looked at the name on the screen for a long time. 7 months of silence, not one text, not one call on my birthday in March. Not one message when I'd sent the kids cards for the first day of school. 7 months of nothing, and now his name on my phone like nothing had happened. I answered. "Dad." His voice had that quality I'd almost forgotten, tighter than it used to be, like a rubber band stretched one season too long. "Hi, I know it's been a while." "It has," I said. "I've been thinking about everything. About Christmas, and things in general. I think I'd like to have a better relationship. I think maybe we should try." Something in me wanted to reach toward that immediately. Some part of me that had never stopped being his father sat up and leaned toward the phone. I'd like that too, I said carefully. Good. I'm actually coming through Halifax next week for work. I thought maybe we could grab coffee. We met at a cafe near the waterfront on a Thursday morning. Dean arrived looking older than I remembered. Thinner, shadows under his eyes, a tightness around his mouth that I recognize as the look men get when they're managing more than they can handle. We ordered, we made small talk. He asked about Halifax, the hardware store, whether I was seeing anyone. I told him about the city, the job, the friends I'd made. I didn't mention Cordelia yet. Some instinct told me to wait. Dean listened. He nodded. His hands moved constantly, adjusting his coffee cup, straightening the sugar packets, running his thumb along the edge of the table. And then he started talking about the investment. It had begun 2 years ago, he said. A contact of Annette's family had a business opportunity, a craft brewing operation in Northern Ontario that needed startup capital. They'd put in their savings. They'd liquidated a portion of their RRSP early, taking the tax hit because they'd believed completely in the idea. But the market had shifted. Supply chain problems. Unexpected competition from larger operations. They were now carrying significant debt, their retirement savings were gone, and the business was months away from folding entirely. Unless they could get a cash injection to carry them through the next 2 quarters. I sat across from my son and watched him build this case the way I'd once watched him build arguments as a teenager. Methodical, patient, laying one brick carefully on top of the last. He was preparing me, and I had been prepared enough times before to recognize exactly what this was. How much, I said, before he could get to it himself. He blinked. $40,000, he said. $40,000, Dad. I know that sounds like a lot, but you have it. I know what the Thunder Bay house sold for when you moved. I'll pay it back. We can draw up a formal agreement, have it in writing, whatever makes you comfortable. Dean, I said. I know it's a lot to ask. Dean. He went quiet. I'm not going to give you $40,000, I said. Not because I don't have it. Not because I don't care what happens to you. But you haven't called me in 7 months. Not once. Not on my birthday. And within 20 minutes of sitting down across from me, you're asking me for money. That's not a relationship. That's a transaction. And I'm not willing to pretend it's something else. His jaw tightened. I came here thinking you'd help me. I know. You know how hard it was to make this call? Yes, I said. I imagine it was very hard. That doesn't change my answer. He looked out the window at the harbor. When he looked back, his eyes were flat. Annette always said you'd never show up when it actually mattered, he said quietly. I told her she was wrong about you. I thought about Cordelia's kitchen. I thought about Basil's steady handshake the first time I came to Boxing Day dinner. I thought about Pippa calling me across the yard last Saturday because she'd found a ladybug and needed me specifically to come and look at it. Just me, nobody else. I showed up, I said. For years I showed up, and when I stopped being the version of me that Annette could manage, you both decided I wasn't worth the effort. That's not me being selfish, Dean. That's both of you making a choice. He pushed back from the table. Don't call me, he said. Don't come to the house, don't text me, don't send things to the kids. As far as I'm concerned, this is the last conversation we're having. He left. I sat with my coffee until it went cold. That evening I drove to Cordelia and Basil's house without calling first. Cordelia opened the door, looked at my face, and stood aside without a word. Basil was in the kitchen. Celeste and Jacques were there with Pippa, who was already in her pajamas, and who ran to grab my hand and pulled me toward the living room, because she had something important to show me involving a bird she'd drawn. I let her pull me. Later, after Pippa was in bed and Celeste and Jacques had gone home, I sat with Cordelia and Basil on the back porch and told them about the coffee, the $40,000, and the last thing Dean had said. He won't call again, I said. It wasn't a question. Basil looked out at the harbor lights for a moment. Then he did you the favor of being clear, he said. Some people keep you guessing for years. At least now you know where you stand. Cordelia took my hand. You have us, she said. Whatever comes next, that doesn't change. I held on to those words through the winter and into the spring, and through 5 years of Sundays at their table. 5 years of watching Pippa grow from a gap-toothed 5-year-old, who engineered towers out of dinner, rolls into a 10-year-old with strong opinions about the maple leafs, and a declared intention to become a marine biologist. 5 years of Basil's terrible trifle every Boxing Day and Cordelia's garden in summer, and the particular sound of that house on Sunday evening when everyone was there and the conversation overlapped and nobody was keeping score. Thea's wedding was in September, 5 years after that first Christmas Eve. She'd kept some contact with Dean over the years. Occasional texts, brief updates. She told me this without apologizing for it, and I hadn't asked her to. He was her brother. That was her choice to make, and it was the right one. She told me 3 days before the wedding that she'd sent him an invitation. We were at her kitchen table going over the seating chart. She said it quietly, watching my face. "I don't know if he'll come," she said. "He might not, but I wanted him to see what this day looks like. I wanted him to see what you've built, Dad." I nodded slowly. Something complicated moved through my chest. Not anger, not quite dread. Just a tired sadness for what might have been, and the steadier, clearer feeling underneath it of knowing exactly where I stood. "Okay," I said. "Are you upset?" "No," I said, and I was surprised to find I meant it entirely. The wedding was at a converted farmhouse outside the city, with a field behind it and fairy lights strung between old apple trees. The September evening was warm enough to keep the doors open, and the sound of the string quartet carried out into the orchard. Cordelia and Basil sat with me in the front. Celeste was there with Jacques. Pippa wore a dress she had significant feelings about and spent the ceremony quietly rearranging the ribbon on her program. When Thea came down the aisle, I stood with everyone else. I watched James's face change when he saw her. That was what I focused on, not Dean, not the years of distance, not any of it. Just James's face, the way he looked at her, like he was already deciding he would choose her again every morning for the rest of his life. I cried. Cordelia squeezed my hand. Basil put his arm around my shoulders. The reception moved to the field, and Pippa immediately shed her shoes and ran for the apple trees. And Jacques chased after her, and that was when I saw Dean. He was standing near the entrance to the reception tent in a suit that looked like it had been pressed that morning and hadn't survived the drive. He was holding a glass of something, and he was watching. Not the tent, not the fairy lights or the dance floor or his sister laughing with her new husbands across the grass. He was watching me. He was watching me standing between Cordelia and Basil, while Celeste held a drowsy Pippa against her shoulder. All of us easy in each other's company the way people are when they've chosen each other for 5 years without anyone keeping a tally. I saw his face at the exact moment he understood who they were to me. It wasn't anger. It was the expression of a man who has just realized he lost something he didn't know had value until he saw it clearly, whole, and entirely out of his reach. He crossed the reception toward me. I stood still. "Dad." He said the word carefully, like he was testing the weight of it. "Dean." He looked at Cordelia and Basil. He looked at Celeste. He looked at the empty patch of grass where Pippa had been before she spotted the apple trees. "They didn't tell me," he said. "She didn't know everything to tell," I said. He gestured at the group of us. Are these people?" "I family." It came out simply, because it was simple. He looked at me for a long moment. "I don't understand how that happened," he said. 5 years, and you just—" "I showed up," I said. "That's all it ever was. I showed up and they were kind enough to make room. That's the whole story." He set his glass down on the nearest table. His jaw worked. "I was wrong," he said finally. "About everything, the 40,000, the way I handled Christmas, all of it." He paused. "Annette and I have been separated since March." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. I meant it. I wasn't glad. I just felt the distance between us like a physical thing. Not hostile, just real and honest in a way it had never been before. "I don't know how to fix any of this," he said. "I don't know either," I said. "But if you ever decide you want to try, and I mean really try, not when you need something from me, I'm not unreachable, Dean. I'm just not waiting anymore. There's a difference." He stood there a moment longer, then he turned and walked back through the reception toward the car park. He didn't look back. Cordelia appeared at my elbow. She had a way of doing that, arriving exactly when she was needed without any fuss. "All right?" she asked. "Yes," I said, entirely true. Thea found me later, when the evening had settled into the comfortable noise of a party winding toward its end. She hugged me and held on for a moment longer than usual. "Thank you," she said into my shoulder. "For what?" "For showing me what it looks like," she said. "To keep loving people even when it costs you something. To find your way toward the light even when someone else closed a door on you." She pulled back. "I learned something from watching you these past 5 years, Dad, about what family actually is." I thought about Christmas Eve. A woman with white hair who had walked across a restaurant because she noticed something that most people would have politely looked away from. A child's hand reaching for mine across a table. A business card with an address, written in careful handwriting on the back. "I learned it from a stranger," I told Thea. She sat down across from me when I was alone and she decided I was worth knowing. That's all it was. That's the whole thing. Later, much later, when the fairy lights were still on but most of the guests had gone, Cordelia and I stood at the edge of the apple orchard. Basil and Jacques were carrying chairs back inside. Pippa was asleep across the back seat of Celeste's car, shoes somewhere in the orchard, one sock half off. Cordelia put her arm through mine the way she'd been doing for 3 years now. Like the most natural thing in the world. "Good day," she said. "Good day," I agreed. The September night was cool and clear the way it gets in Nova Scotia when summer is beginning to say goodbye without quite admitting it yet. Above us, the stars were fully out, the sky enormous in the way it only gets when you're standing in a field with no city lights for a kilometer in any direction. I thought about Dean briefly, about the separated marriage, the failed business, the long drive back to wherever he was staying tonight. I hoped genuinely that he'd find his way. I hoped that someday he'd understand the difference between love and debt, between showing up and being used, between choosing someone and simply expecting them to be there. I hoped he'd figure out the kind of man he wanted to be when no one was telling him who that should be. But that was his work to do. It had nothing to do with me anymore. I had Thea, who tomorrow would wake up married and happy and was going to call me from her honeymoon because she actually wanted to talk to her father. I had Basil's firm handshake and his willingness to spend an entire Saturday afternoon on a plumbing project we both knew would take 3 times as long as necessary because neither of us actually wanted to finish it. Had Celeste's laugh and Jacques' cooking and Pippa's absolute certainty from the very beginning that I was someone worth knowing. I had Cordelia, who had crossed a restaurant floor toward a man she'd never met because she noticed something that most people would have politely looked away from and kept walking. I had learned at 62 years old that family is not the people who are supposed to love you. Family is the people who see you on your worst night and quietly decide to sit down across from you. I had a life that was full and real in mine. And standing there in that September field with Cordelia's arm through mine and the light still shining through the apple trees behind us, I understood something I couldn't have grasped on that Christmas Eve, alone in a restaurant on Barrington Street, that the door my son closed had not been the only door. That there are people in this world who will walk across a room toward your grief and ask if you'd like to come and sit with their family. And if you're brave enough to say yes, if you're willing to show up week after week and let yourself be known, you will find that belonging is not something you are born into. It is something you choose. And when you choose it and it chooses you back, there is nothing in this life that compares to it.